true horror stories for rainy nights and sleepless hours. Welcome back. Before we begin tonight's story, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, let's begin. The first thing Daniel noticed was that someone was standing beside his bedroom window. It was almost 3 in the morning. Rain had been falling for hours, tapping against the glass in a steady rhythm that had nearly put him to sleep. The apartment was dark except for the weak blue light from his alarm clock. 3:07 a.m. Daniel stared at the figure outside. For a few seconds, he couldn't move. His bedroom was on the second floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing outside the window where a person could stand. Then lightning flashed. The figure disappeared. Daniel sat up slowly. He told himself it had been a reflection. Maybe a tree. Maybe something the rain had distorted on the glass. He reached for his phone and turned on the flashlight. Nothing. Just the wet window. The apartment building was an old 3-story place on the edge of town. Daniel had moved there 6 months earlier because the rent was cheap and most nights were quiet. Too quiet sometimes. He walked toward the window. The rain had covered the glass with tiny streams of water. Daniel wiped the section clear with his sleeve. The parking lot below was empty. Then he noticed something. There were footprints in the mud. They started near the side of the building. They continued directly beneath his window and stopped. Daniel looked up. His bedroom window was roughly 20 feet above the ground. He stepped away from the glass. A minute later, he heard 3 knocks. Not on the front door, not on the wall, on the window. 3 slow taps. Knock, knock, knock. Daniel froze. He didn't go near it. Another 3 knocks followed. This time they were louder. He grabbed his phone and called the building manager. No answer. He called again. Nothing. Then his phone vibrated. A text message had arrived. Daniel didn't touch the note. He stood in the hallway staring at it, trying to convince himself there was a reasonable explanation. Someone had broken into the building. Someone knew his name. Someone had access to his apartment. That was frightening enough. But the handwriting was the part he couldn't explain. He had written the note to himself. Or at least, whoever wrote it had copied his handwriting perfectly. Daniel grabbed his phone and took a picture before calling the police. While he waited, he checked every window in the apartment. The locks were still intact. The front door was locked. Nothing appeared to be missing. When the police arrived, Daniel explained everything. The officer looked at the note for several seconds. "Have you had problems with anyone recently?" "No." "Any neighbors you don't get along with?" "No." "Anyone who might have access to your apartment?" Daniel shook his head. Then the officer asked something that made him uncomfortable. "Did you actually see someone outside your window?" Daniel hesitated. "I saw a person. Could it have been a reflection?" "I don't think so." The officer nodded but didn't seem convinced. He took the note as evidence. Before leaving, he told Daniel to call if anything else happened. Daniel watched the police car disappear through the rain. Then he noticed his upstairs neighbor standing at the end of the hallway. Her name was Mrs. Carter. She was an elderly woman who rarely spoke to anyone. She was staring at Daniel. "You heard it too," she said. Daniel frowned. "Heard what?" "The knocking." His stomach tightened. "Last night." She nodded. 3 knocks. Daniel asked her what she knew. Mrs. Carter looked toward the stairwell. Then she lowered her voice. "Don't answer it." "Answer what?" She didn't respond. Instead, she walked back into her apartment and shut the door. Daniel stood there for several seconds. That afternoon, he went downstairs to speak with the building manager. The manager, a man named Lewis, was working in a small office beside the lobby. When Daniel described what happened, Lewis became unusually quiet. Finally, Daniel asked, "Has anything like this happened before?" Lewis looked at him. "Why would you ask that?" "Because my neighbor seemed to know about it." Lewis sighed. Then he pulled out an old folder from a filing cabinet. The building had been there for almost 50 years. According to Lewis, a previous tenant had disappeared from Daniel's apartment about 12 years earlier, a young man named Michael Reed. He had lived alone. One rainy night, He called the police and claimed someone was standing outside his bedroom window. The police found nothing. 2 nights later, Michael disappeared. His car was still in the parking lot. His wallet was inside the apartment. His phone was charging beside his bed. But Michael was never found. Daniel felt cold despite the warm room. What happened to the apartment afterward? Louis looked down. It stayed empty for almost a year. Why? Louis didn't answer immediately. Then he said something Daniel wished he hadn't heard. Because the next tenant complained about footsteps outside his bedroom. Daniel stared at him. What happened to him? Louis closed the folder. He moved out. After how long? 3 days. That evening, Daniel packed a bag. He decided he would stay at a hotel until he figured everything out. At 11:40 p.m., he was standing in the apartment doorway when his phone vibrated. Another unknown number. This time, there was only one message. Michael wasn't the first. Daniel stared at the screen. Then another message appeared, and he wasn't the last. The hallway lights suddenly went out. In the darkness, Daniel heard 3 slow knocks. But this time, they came from inside his apartment. Knock, knock, knock. Daniel slowly turned toward his bedroom. The door was closed, and underneath it, a thin line of water was beginning to spread across the floor. Daniel didn't move. The water continued spreading beneath the bedroom door. It was dark, almost black in the weak light from the hallway. He could hear rain outside, but the bedroom window was closed, locked. There was no reason for water to be coming from inside the room. Daniel stepped backward. His phone was still in his hand. The screen showed 11:42 p.m. Then the screen went black. The battery had been above 60% only a few minutes earlier. He tried turning it back on. Nothing. Another knock came from the bedroom. 3 taps. Daniel left the apartment. He didn't even lock the door. He ran downstairs and waited outside in the rain until a taxi arrived. He spent the night at a cheap motel on the other side of town. He barely slept. At around 4 in the morning, he woke up suddenly. Someone was knocking on the motel room door. 3 times. Daniel sat completely still. Knock, knock, knock. Then silence. He looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. He waited. Nothing. Finally, he returned to bed. At sunrise, he checked his phone. There was one new photograph. Daniel didn't remember taking it. The picture showed his bedroom. The angle was strange. It looked as though someone had taken the photograph while standing inside the room. In the center of the picture was the bedroom window, and standing outside it was a person. Daniel zoomed in. His stomach dropped. The person looked exactly like him. Same height, same dark hair, same gray shirt, but the photograph had been taken from inside the apartment. Daniel immediately called Louis. He asked him to meet at the building. When they arrived, Daniel went straight to his apartment. The front door was still open. Nothing had been stolen, but the bedroom looked different. The carpet was wet. The walls around the window were covered with faint water stains. Daniel looked beneath the bed. There was something hidden there, a small metal box. Louis told him not to touch it. Daniel opened it anyway. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all taken from inside the bedroom. Some showed the window, some showed the hallway. Others showed people Daniel had never seen before. Different people, different years. But every photograph had one thing in common: rain. Daniel picked up the oldest photograph. On the back was a date from 26 years earlier. There was a woman standing beside the window. Underneath the photograph, someone had written, "She heard the knocking first." Another photograph showed a man. He opened the door. The next showed an empty bedroom. He never came back. Daniel kept searching. Then he found a photograph of Michael Reed. He was sitting on the edge of the same bed Daniel had slept in. Michael looked terrified. On the back were 4 words: "Don't let him in." Daniel looked at Louis. "Who is him?" Louis didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the window. There were fresh fingerprints on the inside of the glass. Daniel moved closer. The fingerprints were wet. 5 long marks. as though someone had pressed their hand against the window from inside the room. Then Daniel noticed something written in the condensation. A single word. Behind. He turned around. Nothing. Then the bedroom door slowly began closing. Daniel stepped backward. Don't. The door stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then someone whispered from directly behind him. Daniel. He spun around. Nobody was there. Louis ran into the hallway. Daniel followed. They reached the stairs. But before leaving, Daniel looked back at the bedroom. The window was open. Rain was pouring inside. And standing on the other side of the glass was a man. Michael Reed. Daniel knew it immediately. He had seen his photograph. Michael raised one hand. Then he pointed toward the hallway, not toward Daniel. Behind him, Daniel slowly turned. At the end of the hallway stood another figure. A man wearing the same gray shirt Daniel was wearing. The figure smiled. Then the lights went out. Welcome back. Before we begin tonight's story, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, let's begin. The first thing Daniel noticed was that someone was standing beside his bedroom window. It was almost 3 in the morning. Rain had been falling for hours, tapping against the glass in a steady rhythm that had nearly put him to sleep. The apartment was dark except for the weak blue light from his alarm clock. 3:07 a.m. Daniel stared at the figure outside. For a few seconds, he couldn't move. His bedroom was on the second floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing outside the window where a person could stand. Then lightning flashed. The figure disappeared. Daniel sat up slowly. He told himself it had been a reflection. Maybe a tree. Maybe something the rain had distorted on the glass. He reached for his phone and turned on the flashlight. Nothing. Just the wet window. The apartment building was an old 3-story place on the edge of town. Daniel had moved there 6 months earlier because the rent was cheap and most nights were quiet. Too quiet sometimes. He walked toward the window. The rain had covered the glass with tiny streams of water. Daniel wiped a section clear with his sleeve. The parking lot below was empty. Then he noticed something. There were footprints in the mud. They started near the side of the building. They continued directly beneath his window and stopped. Daniel looked up. His bedroom window was roughly 20 feet above the ground. He stepped away from the glass. A minute later, he heard 3 knocks. Not on the front door, not on the wall, on the window. 3 slow taps. Knock, knock, knock. Daniel froze. He didn't go near it. Another 3 knocks followed. This time they were louder. He grabbed his phone and called the building manager. No answer. He called again. Nothing. Then his phone vibrated. A text message had arrived. A woman named Emily Hart. She had lived in the apartment before Michael. Her final police report mentioned hearing 3 knocks on her bedroom window during a storm. 3 days later, she disappeared. Another tenant disappeared 8 years afterward. Then another. The pattern continued. Every few years. Always during heavy rain. Always the same apartment. Always 3 knocks. Daniel found something else. A handwritten statement from a former tenant. It said, "I saw myself standing outside the window." Daniel looked at Louis. "That's what I saw." Louis nodded. "That's why I wanted you to leave." "Why?" "Because the people who saw themselves." Louis stopped. Daniel waited. What happened to them? Louis looked toward the basement stairs. Nobody knows. A loud bang came from upstairs. Both men froze. Then another, and another. 3 knocks. But this time they weren't coming from a window. They were coming from the apartment door. Louis whispered, "Stay here." He climbed the stairs. Daniel followed. When they reached the lobby, the front door was shaking. Someone was standing outside. A silhouette. The person was completely soaked. Louis moved toward the door. Daniel grabbed his arm. "Don't." The silhouette slowly raised its head. Daniel could see the face through the rain-covered glass. It was him. Same face, same clothes, same expression. The figure lifted one hand and placed it against the glass. Then it smiled. Daniel stepped backward. The figure pointed toward the ceiling. Suddenly, the building's fire alarm began screaming. Lewis ran upstairs. Daniel followed. Smoke was coming from the second floor, but there was no fire. The alarm had been triggered manually. Daniel entered his apartment. The bedroom door was wide open. On the wall above the bed, someone had written a message in wet fingerprints. "One of US has to stay." Daniel heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Lewis was standing in the doorway, but something was wrong. Lewis was smiling. Daniel stepped back. "Lewis?" Lewis tilted his head. Then he whispered, "Daniel." His voice sounded exactly like Daniel's. The lights went out, and from somewhere inside the darkness came 3 quiet knocks. Daniel couldn't see anything. The apartment was completely dark. He heard Lewis breathing somewhere near the doorway. Then silence. "Daniel." The voice sounded like Lewis again. Daniel didn't answer. He remembered what Mrs. Carter had said. "Don't answer it." A flash of lightning illuminated the bedroom. For less than a second, Daniel saw 2 people standing in the room. One was Lewis. The other looked exactly like Daniel. Both were staring at him. Another flash. Only Lewis remained. Daniel ran. He pushed past Lewis and sprinted down the stairs. Behind him, footsteps followed. Fast. He reached the lobby and grabbed the front door. It wouldn't open. The lock had been turned from the inside. He pulled harder. Nothing. Then he heard someone whisper beside his ear, "You can't leave yet." Daniel spun around. Nobody was there. The rain outside became louder, almost impossibly loud. Then the front door suddenly opened. Daniel ran into the parking lot. He didn't stop until he reached the main road. A police car found him several minutes later. The officers took him to the station. Daniel told them everything. They went back to the apartment building with him. But when they arrived, something was different. The building manager's office was empty. Lewis was gone. The police searched every room. They found no sign of him. They also found something else. The bedroom window was broken, but there was no broken glass inside the room. All of it was lying outside, as if the window had been broken from inside. The police searched the apartment again. They found the metal box beneath the bed. Inside was one final photograph. Daniel was standing outside the apartment building. It was raining. The photograph had been taken from the bedroom window. On the back was a date. That date was tomorrow. Daniel refused to return to the apartment. He moved to another city 2 weeks later. For months, nothing happened. He eventually convinced himself that the entire experience had been some kind of elaborate break-in. Maybe Lewis had been involved. Maybe someone had been stalking the tenants. Maybe there had never been anything supernatural about it. Then one night it rained. Daniel was living alone in a small house hundreds of miles away. He was lying in bed when he heard it. 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. He opened his eyes. His bedroom window was beside the bed. He didn't move. Another 3 knocks. This time they were louder. Daniel reached for his phone. 3:07 a.m. Exactly the same time. A notification appeared. It was from an unknown number. There was no text, only a photograph. Daniel opened it. His heart stopped. The photograph showed his current bedroom, taken from outside the window. He slowly looked toward the glass. A figure was standing in the rain. Daniel couldn't see its face. Then lightning flashed. The figure was gone. His phone vibrated again. Another photograph appeared. This one showed Daniel sitting in bed, but the photograph had been taken from inside the room. Daniel stared at the image. Behind him, in the photograph, stood a man. He was wearing a gray shirt. Daniel slowly turned around. Nothing was there. Then he heard a whisper, not from the phone, not from outside, from underneath his bed. "Daniel!" He froze. The voice continued. "You looked again." Daniel didn't move. His phone screen went black. The rain stopped. For the first time that night, the house became completely silent. Then came 3 knocks. Not on the window, not on the door, under the bed. Knock, knock, knock. Daniel never told anyone what happened next. But according to the police report filed the following morning, his front door was still locked from the inside. His phone was found on the bed. The bedroom window was open, and wet footprints led from the window to the empty space beside the bed. There were no footprints leading back. Daniel was never found. The final photograph recovered from his phone was never explained. It showed the same bedroom, the same bed, the same window, but this time someone was standing outside, and beneath the bed, two pale hands were reaching toward the floor.